Today, we're going to talk about vocabulary. Hello and welcome. Welcome to Input English. The topic for today is vocabulary. We all know that languages are made up of lots of words, and as a new speaker of any language we're trying to learn, the challenge is we don't know a lot of those words, and we need more words. We need a bigger vocabulary, right? Well, sure, vocabulary is important. Vocabulary, the words, these are the building blocks of the language. If you're going to study architecture, you could study architecture, the design, the function, the engineering. You could examine architecture from an aesthetic point of view, or you could study bricks. And I think we have in the language learning community historically been guilty of trying to study bricks, trying to understand these words in simplistic ways and forgetting the language itself. Comprehensible input was described in the 1970s, but it was really introduced to the language learning community in the 1980s. Comprehensible input did not have a great deal of marketing behind it. No, there was not a big corporate push to promote comprehensible input. It was done as a more academic approach of sharing information to people, and some books were published. It took the imagination of people to implement these new methods. When comprehensible input was first introduced, critics were quick to say, well, that's very interesting, but you need something else. You need something more. It's not enough. Or it's not as good as our traditional methods, or it's no better than our traditional methods. The studies have shown that it is. From a personal point of view, I tell you that my experience supports that completely. When I tried to learn languages by traditional methods, failure was the rule. But when I learned language by listening and listening a great deal, then that's where the progress was made. So how do we resolve the need to develop a vocabulary with the fact that we're just listening and then reading? And is that really sufficient to develop a good vocabulary? Well, it is. If you look at your effort in learning, in this case, English, the most valuable commodity is your time. And we need to be good shepherds of our time. We need to not waste our time on useless activities. Comprehensible input takes advantage of our evolutionary development of a brain that naturally acquires language. Don't forget, little babies within a few years are talking, they're speaking their own language, they're using good grammar, and they have a very serviceable vocabulary, but not one of those children ever studied a list of vocabulary words. I would submit that your time is too valuable to waste it on vocabulary lists. Why? Well, if you study vocabulary, you study the individual words or bricks of the language, you have a very simplistic definition of that word. You basically are translating it to your native language. And then if you try to go use that in conversation, you won't have a rich understanding of that word. You'll have a very discrete, specific understanding of it. And that's not the way languages work. We use words to mean lots of different things in different contexts. A second problem with trying to learn lists of vocabulary is retention. You won't remember the words. You won't remember the definitions, and you will have a very simplistic picture in your mind. If you do remember these words, you'll have a very simplistic understanding of the word that will be less useful to you. If, on the other hand, you don't study vocabulary and you focus on input, and you get a great deal of input, thousands of hours of input, then your understanding of the word will have many different connections. You will have heard it used here. You will have heard it used there. You will have heard it meaning this. You'll have understood it can mean that under certain circumstances. And so your vocabulary will develop not as a translation to your native language, this equals that, which is weak. It will turn into a network of understanding where this word is connected to a variety of circumstances, meanings, things in your world without referencing your native language. If you try to learn language by translation, which I've done, what happens is when you start hearing things, you can't translate fast enough to process the input. Translation is fundamentally too slow for that. Also, going the other direction, if you're thinking the thoughts in your native language and then translating it word for word into the target language, there's no conversation slow enough for that to work for you. So translation is intimately related to this idea of building vocabulary lists. Why are we in love with vocabulary lists? Because they're easy to count. You can tell a student your vocabulary is 10,000 words. You can make an app and put it on a cell phone, and by going through some process, you can estimate the person's vocabulary. You have a vocabulary of 6,000 words. So the ease of measuring word counts and vocabulary is a little seductive for some people. It draws them in because it's so easy to quantitate. The trouble is, it's meaningless. If you're traveling in the US and you encounter a native English speaker, they will never come up to you and say, "How many words do you know in English?" They're not interested. They will never ask you. It's a question never asked. All the places in the world I have traveled and tried to speak various languages at a very low traveler's level, not one time did anyone ever ask me how many words I knew in that language. So let's go back to architecture. Architecture is very rich, it's very interesting. There are many ways of looking at architecture. Don't reduce architecture down to a study of bricks. Okay, so a side issue that's related, what about looking words up in a dictionary? In general, don't do it. Why? Well, same reason. A dictionary definition gives you a very superficial understanding of that word. It doesn't give you the network of meanings that that word can have when you learn the language for real. The other thing is looking something up in a dictionary breaks your rhythm. So if you're listening and you stop the podcast or stop the video, you could have continued. You could have gotten more input, but instead you broke your concentration, you stopped the input process completely in order to look something up. If you're reading, okay, you put the book down or you put your electronic reader down and you pull up a dictionary and you look at it. You've broken your rhythm and it's hard to get back into that rhythm of getting more input. You really slowed yourself down a lot. So in most cases, when you see a word you don't know, just jump over it and keep going. Ignore it. Now, we have another rule that you may remember, the rule never say never. So you might ask, if we were having a conversation, do you look up words? When you were studying Spanish intensely, did you look up words? And the answer is, of course. But that, of course, doesn't give you much information. The reason I would look up a word would be if the story makes no sense without knowing that word. If it's a crucial word so that you can get the understanding of the story, then you might want to look it up. So if you're on an electronic reader, like a Kindle, they have built-in dictionaries. That dictionary will give you a hint. But this is a little different because you are now in the story and you're looking for a hint what that word means so that you can stay in the story. So this is very slick. You're reading in Kindle and you're reading and you're reading and you're reading, and this word keeps coming up and it's super important and the story isn't making a great deal of sense, and you went back a few pages trying to figure out what they were talking about, and you say, well, I need to know what that word is. You touch it, you get a quick hint of what it is, and now the story is starting to make a lot more sense. Find your place and move on. I do that. I don't do it very often, and as my level gets higher, I do it less and less. Ideally, you're not starting out your language journey in a new language, in this case English, with reading. Ideally, you're starting out your journey listening. So there's no slick way to stop listening and look up a word without just stopping the input process. A complete beginner may have to do that. However, there's another way to look at that. If a complete beginner is having to look up a lot of words related to things he or she is hearing in the input or seeing on a video, perhaps the content they have chosen is at too high a level and they should stop and find content that's easier. find content where they can figure out the words without using a dictionary. The repeated use of a dictionary suggests to me that the content level is too high. Why does this matter? One word: efficiency. If you spend your time listening, stopping, looking up, listening, stopping, looking up, listening, stopping, looking up, your progress will be super slow. If, on the other hand, the input that you've chosen is sufficiently simple, sufficiently basic, that you understand most of the words and you understand the story, then your efficiency will be much higher. Under the rule, never say never, sure, if you have to, look up a word. I look up a word maybe once a week, maybe twice a month. It's fairly uncommon because I'd rather just get more input, more and more input. A practical matter is a lot of the time that I am listening to podcasts, I'm driving a car. There's not a prayer. I'm going to be pulling out a cell phone and trying to find a dictionary function and looking up a word while I'm driving with the other hand. That's completely unsafe, inappropriate, wrong answer. Don't even think about doing that. Input English is a bridge. We are producing these videos so that people can get enough input to raise their level of understanding of the language to where they can take advantage of the huge amount of native content that is available. You have probably noticed as an English language learner that if you put on a video, you observe that the conversation goes very fast and it's hard to follow. Or you try to talk to somebody in English and it's hard to find the words. These experiences allow us to be tempted to focus on the vocabulary. And I would caution you to just don't lose your way. You're here not because you want to have a vocabulary of 10,000 words in English. You are here because you would like to understand English better, and you would like to speak English confidently with a good pronunciation. You would like to speak English so that people understand you. This language is all about conversations. So, to summarize, my recommendation on vocabulary is basically ignore it. If you get sufficient input that is sufficiently comprehensible that you understand the story, you will build a big vocabulary. But the vocabulary you build with comprehensible input will have the richness of all the connections that those words can have, not just a translation into your native language. Yes, you can look things up in the dictionary, but every time you do that, you decrease your efficiency of learning. I would recommend you rarely look things up in the dictionary, and do so when it will help you understand the story of the input. What are they talking about? What's happening in this story? If you understand the story, you'll get the words. We also don't want to stifle human curiosity. If you are listening to content or watching a video and a word is introduced that you have never heard of, in the name of human curiosity, you could stop and look it up. So that celebration of human curiosity was exemplified this morning while I was watching a video in Spanish, and the word that was spoken was cihuela, which is the small piece of bone or plastic at the top of the string of a guitar. Cihuela. I didn't know that word. And I wanted that word, but not because it made no sense. Otherwise, I understood this story. I just was temporarily in love with that word. So, in the name of human curiosity, I looked it up. I got the spelling and a little bit more understanding of it. But I do that rarely. So if your curiosity compels you to look up a word, it's okay. Bear in mind, if you look up a lot of words, it's not a very efficient way to learn the language. Another issue with vocabulary is that there are different kinds of vocabulary. There is the vocabulary of the day-to-day. Hello, my name is Joseph. How are you? Where's the bathroom? I'm hungry. I need something to drink. The day-to-day. This is important because the day-to-day is a big part of our existence. There are vocabularies associated with technology. There are different vocabularies associated with photography or sports. So depending upon where your interests lie, your content will bring you those vocabularies. When I attained a level of comprehension in Spanish high enough, I started adding native content for my source of input. What comes to mind is videos on photography, videos on making videos, and videos on technology like drones, things I'm interested in. Another way of getting a different vocabulary is by getting into literature. Literature is vast. You can read books by American authors, British authors. You can read works from all over the world translated into English. You can take advantage of literature. The language that you get reading an American author from the 21st century is going to be very different than the vocabulary you get from an author from England in the 19th century. As your level gets high enough, you can make conscious decisions on this, or you could do more what I did, which is read what you like to read. Not everything has to be calculated. Not everything has to be contrived. You can just read what you like and absorb the vocabulary from that. Now, We haven't made this video, but I foreshadow one that's coming up entitled When You Are Ready. I haven't decided if that's going to be a video. It's more likely going to be a series of videos entitled When You Are Ready. And it's an invitation to look at the literature that I'm familiar with, written in English, that is an absolute joy to read. So that will be shared with you in the future, but it's on the production list further out. Well, that's it for our treatment of vocabulary, and I encourage you to come back and join us on another video. Also, you're welcome to leave comments below. See you soon. Bye.